All right, we're going to go over chapter 16. Before we do, I just wanted to show you really quick, just as an example here. This was, not that one, this was Mr. Gudmested's presentation on what we just went over. And you'll notice it's almost an hour long. Now, what he does is he typically blends together the PowerPoints and maybe a demo or the code that's in the book, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. That's his way of doing it. What I have done historically over the years is during the summer, and I'll probably end up doing it again this summer, is during the summer, I go over the PowerPoints and I create separate lectures just on the PowerPoints. All right. So for instance, if you go out to my YouTube channel, again, I'm just showing you the difference. I'm not saying his is right, mine's wrong, or anything like that. But if you go out to mine, you'll notice there's 100 videos out there right now. And all the ones at the beginning are what we did in class. All right, but if you go down to after, where it starts, you'll notice, I gotta go down the ways. Come on, there's chapter 4, there's someplace. Chapter 1, okay. So when you start going through here, what you'll notice is I've got stuff for every chapter that's in here, 24, 25, 26, etc. So I've got the same stuff in here. And this is when I go over the PowerPoints. That's just the way that I do it. He doesn't. There's a lot of reasons he does things the way that he does them and the way that I do them. All right. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. All right. Let's see. So let's jump into chapter 16 here. It's a shorter chapter. First thing they talk about is how to organize your classes. One thing to realize, you don't have to make a new file every time you create a class. You can put a class file inside of another class file. Now, typically, if you're going to do that, it should be for a very small class. All right, you could argue and say, well, most of the ones we've done are pretty small, and yeah, you can do it that way. All right, and I'm not going to say most people do and most people don't. I'm just saying you can do it that way. Also, you may have noticed when you've looked at some of your classes that before the class name, they'll have before the word class, they'll have the word partial. When you've got a partial class, what that means is a class typically is getting so big or has the potential to get so big that you break it up into 2 or more files. Each one of them becomes part of a partial class. All right. And they'll talk in here about how to work with namespaces. All right. Finally, they'll come in and they'll talk about, not finally, but they'll talk about XML documentation. Have you ever noticed? I'm asking you this question. If you haven't, no big thing. But you know how to add a multi-line comment in .NET. You start it with a /*, you end it with a //. You know how to create a single line comment in .NET with a //. What you may or may not know is if you put 3 slashes in at the beginning, your code turns gray. And that allows you to put in XML comment, an extensible markup language comment into your code. It's just another kind of documentation you can choose to put in if you'd like to. So we'll talk about that. Finally, with the how to create and use class libraries, again, we've done that already. If you remember, I purposely did that where we created the app that we did first. I don't remember anymore what it was, but we created the class library, and then we utilized the library in a console. Then we went back and utilized the same library in a GUI. It's kind of what they do to end the chapter. It's a very short chapter, so I imagine it's only going to take 10 minutes or so, and that's totally fine. All right, it's been a long period anyway. So, as it says, in most cases, you'll code each class that's required by an application in a separate file. If 2 or more classes are closely related, you might want to consider storing them in the same file. And they show you 2 ways that you can do that. The first way, one right after the other. Public class followed by one, public class followed by the other. I am mentioning this just because I want this to kind of, for lack of better words, you've heard it for those of you or everybody in here once you get to the 4th semester. Java does not allow you to do this like this. You can't have 2 classes in there. You can do it the second way. The second way is what are called nested classes, when you put a class inside of a class. I would say that when you're first learning object-oriented programming, and that's what this class, one of the things that this class here, that the C# class is about, I wouldn't do either one of these. I would put each of my classes in their own file. But in Java, you can do this. Big difference though between Java, just so you know, and C#. See in C# how these are both public? Can you see this on the screen? You see how these are both public? In Java, you can have only one public class per file. So if I were to make a class inside, this would have to be private. Inner classes in Java must be private. In fact, before when I showed you that president list program, we use something that's called a recycler view. You say, I don't know what that is. If you got a contact list on your phone, you know what it is. When you can just kind of whip through there and basically it'll kind of redraw the screen real quick. That's pretty much what that is. When you work with a recycler view, you can use the potential for a lot of nested or inner classes. All right. So again, when two classes are closely related, you can in this language you can do it in two ways. The first way, as shown there, is to code them one after the other. I don't see what benefit that provides you, except they're both together in the same file and you can see them both at the same time. I don't think with the way the editor works that that's all that advantageous. You may agree with that, you may not agree with that. All right. Another way, as it says, is to add two classes, is to nest one within the other. It says this is useful when one class is used only within the context of another class. The way that works too, just so you know, and this is Java or it's C#, but let's just use C#. So I've got public class 1, and I've got all my stuff in there. And then inside of that, I've got public class, let's just see, we call it C1.1. All right, and I've got stuff here, and I've got stuff here, maybe even stuff down there. You all with me? This inner class can use anything that's defined in its outer class. So sometimes that's very advantageous. All right, and one of the reasons that you typically, and you do it in Java and why it's private there, is this is sometimes referred to as a helper class, because this class will help what it's contained inside of. That's usually the way that it's used. The only difference is, again, it can be public inside of a public in C#, and you can't do that in Java. All right. And you'll hear that again in the Java class. It's not like, oh my gosh, I'll have to remember that. No, I just wanted you to hear it. All right. So as it says on the last bullet there, to refer to a nested class from another class, you must qualify it. So in the example I just gave you, you'd have to say class or C1.C1.1 type of an idea. All right, and that can be confusing. A lot of people find that confusing. All right, how to split a class across multiple files. This is that partial class idea again. All right, it says to do that, you just code the keyword partial before the class keyword to indicate that the members of the class, it says may or may not be split across multiple source files. Notice may or may not, but all it means is this class has the potential to grow and over time may have to be split into 2 or more files. I mean, you could make the argument and say, well, then shouldn't I do that with every class? Yeah, if you were working in a quote real job, unquote, on an application, you'd probably find loads of these. All right. The other advantage of doing that too is different programmers can work on different parts of the same class. All right. And you can go in and you can define stuff and be able to use it in both of the classes. All right. And I shouldn't say both of the classes, both parts of the same class. So here they have split it. Now notice they both say public partial class customer. That's a little confusing. All right. But basically it would have to be like that because it's the same file. It's like, you were able to take a file and, that you had on, an Explorer and break it into 2 files because it got so big, but the name didn't change. All right. So they show a form class. This is what you've seen, whether you realize it or not. That's usually what your form says. All right. So as it says, partial classes can be used to split code for a class across multiple files. If the class you're working on becomes very long, or you want different programmers to work on different parts, it can be advantageous to do that. Visual Studio uses partial classes to separate the code that's generated for a form from the code that's entered by the programmer. What does that mean? Remember those files that we've looked at? I told you that you shouldn't dink with that form designer file. You know what I'm talking about? We're going to look at that after the break. We're even going to show, I'm going to show you how you can add your own stuff to it. Now, should you? No. Can you? Yes. But yeah, you know, it goes with a caveat that if you know what you're doing, and you may go, oh, I don't know what then you shouldn't do it. But I'll show you basically the way we've been doing stuff. We're also going to go in, if you remember one of the things that I showed you earlier, we're used to using the properties window and putting in properties, right? But I've shown you where you can click on that lightning bolt. We're going to click on that lightning bolt. We're going to type our own thing in there for the name of a method, and we're going to hit enter. Boom, it makes the method for us. And I'm going to show you when you do that exactly what happens in the form designer file. All right. All right. Namespaces says, as you know, a namespace is a container that is used to group related classes. All of the .NET framework classes that are used for creating Windows forms are in system.windows.forms namespace. So it's a mechanism that can be used for putting like stuff together and making it available. You know, again, I go back to the one that I showed you almost at the beginning of the semester, the using static system.console. All right. Typically you do that for one of two reasons. One is the reason I had you do that, the shortcut. And the other one, when we get into databases, you're going to have to, we're going to put in some variable names, and we put in the type and then the variable name. Like we put in int age. We might have something like, I don't know, data table, and then call it table. And the system may or may not know what that means. But it'll always show you that light bulb. And then when you click on it, it'll say, hey, if you might want me to add this using statement. All right, so it'll add that namespace so that you're able to use that stuff. Every C# class you create must also belong to a namespace. And again, we've done this. If you remember when we created that class library, we started to do this. And then we used the using statement. We did a reference, which allowed us to use the using statement to bring that class library into our program. That's what they're getting to here. You can nest namespaces. In fact, it says most of the .NET Framework namespaces are nested. If you want more on that, again, just go out to docs.microsoft.com and put in namespaces. For simple projects, it says you don't need to worry about namespaces because Visual Studio takes care of them for you. It says it becomes an issue in two situations. The first occurs if you copy a class from one project to another class, to another project. All right. It says when you do that, you may need to change the name of the namespace in the class file because otherwise it thinks it's getting it from one place and it's not. The second it says is if you want to share a class among several projects rather by creating a class library, which is what the chapter here is going to end with. So there's a namespace. Again, by default, it's always created for you, right? You give it the name of the project, that becomes the name of your namespace. All right. You can, again, have a namespace within a namespace. Do it like that or do it like this. All right. Either way, then it's the name of the main namespace dot the sub namespace. All right. I don't want to read this to you, but because it's just the stuff we just went over. All right. XML documentation, again, as it says, if you look right here, see the triple forward slashes? This turns a real light gray. You can barely read it on your screen. All right. Do you have to do this? No. But it's a way of providing internal program documentation. This is the first semester in the Java class that I did not show Java doc documentation. We only spent 2 weeks on Java, and that's why we jumped right into Android after that. But just want to show you the reason that you might want to use something like this. Okay, and I'm going to use Java as an example. All right, if I go out to Java and I go, let's see, Java APIs. I'm just going to grab one. It doesn't matter which one of these I grab. Well, where is it? Java Documentation Cloud. They change this website all the time. Hopefully this will work. API documentation embedded. There. All right. If I go and click on one of these things, I'm going to click on this aborted exception that's right here. And hopefully you can all see this. I'm going to make this nice and big. All right. But you can come in here and you can add different information that says what parameters, for example, this thing expects. What kind of value does it return, etc. That's typically the type of information that you end up putting into XML documentation. So if we look at what they had in the book here, there's a summary of what you're trying to do. They're using it as summaries. But you can set this up any way you want to. So notice this is very similar to the Java doc stuff. As it says, it provides a general description of a class or property. There's the values. And why would you do that? Because sometimes when you're working, especially with complex objects, it can get very difficult for people who are maintaining existing code to figure out what the heck it is they're supposed to be doing. And if you use crummy names, which is what most professional programmers do anyway, it's sometimes hard to track stuff down. But this is a place where you can put that in. Does it make the program work faster? No, it makes it run slower. Every time you put comments into a program, it runs slower. And the first thing the compiler is going to do is throw out all the comments anyway. But you put them in not for you, but you guys are, all of you in here are probably too young to remember, but it used to be when you bought software, you got a real thick manual, an external manual. Now it's internal. Again, I can't do it in here. You found that out because of the software that I'm using with Camtasia. But if you hit F1 in your program and you're on a button, it's going to bring you help for a button, right? All right. In much the same way, you might decide to put internal program documentation in so that people who may end up maintaining your program have a clue as to what the heck it is you were trying to do. All right. So you can have returns, parameters, etc. Explain all that stuff. To view it, all right, it says the XML documentation you add to a class is visible in the screen tips that are displayed in the code editor. Have you ever noticed that sometimes when you put your mouse over something, like if you've never done this before, I gave you that simple example before with that convert dot to decimal. Just take your mouse and put it over convert dot to decimal. And it'll show you something like this, where it explains what it's doing. Sometimes it'll have a downward arrow, which means that there are a bunch of different ways that you can do it. In other words, that particular method is overloaded, not overridden, overloaded. You can do it in more than one way. All right. All right. And the last thing here is, again, the idea behind class libraries is you want to be able to share code, and you don't want to constantly have to be going in there and changing your namespaces, etc. So you take your class library, you make it available to the program. All right. You put anything in there you want to be able to share among different classes. All right, very similar again to what we did. As it says here, they provide a central locale for storing classes used by 2 or more applications. All right, when you store a class in the library, you don't have to include it in each application. Rather, you just include a reference to it with the using statement. You may put the reference in it, which allows you to put in the using. When you modify a class in the class library, the changes are immediately available to any applications that have the using statement for that library. All right. It says to create a class library, you develop a class library project. Then you build the project. Now it says Visual Studio creates a DLL, which is a dynamic link library file that it does. It's one of those things that it happens behind the scenes. It says it's that DLL that you can actually use to refer to from any app that needs to use the library. All right, to provide the reference for it. All right, then they go through how to create one. We've done this, so I'm not going to run through it with you. All right, but when you do it, again, the idea is It says you do the new project dialog, but you choose the class library template. It automatically gives you a thing that just says class 1 in there. Typically, you want to just get rid of that and start and put your own stuff in. All right. Adding a reference, we did that. I showed you how to right mouse click on the name of your solution, your project, include and choose add and reference. If I go to references, it shows me all the ones I currently have. If I choose add reference, it's going to show me this. And if you've got a class library, it'll typically probably either be under projects or shared projects. You check it, boom, it's now available. You can put in your using statement and start using it. And that's what they explain in here. And that's it. All right, so again, tomorrow I hope to have something created for you. And I'll make you this promise. If I don't have it done by tomorrow, tomorrow will be lab ball period, and we'll do it Monday. If I get it done tonight, we'll go over it tomorrow. But one thing I do want to do at the beginning of class tomorrow is go over the Chapter 12 written test. All right? And we'll talk about the other written tests next week. That's all I got.